This week's Dev Diary introduces a whole new set of political changes and production methods that further emphasize just how gruesome the 19th century was. All these changes are coming on the 11th of December, and if you want the full discussion, here it is. First off, let's start with the new production methods. Plantations will now have new production methods based on your slavery and labor laws. No longer will slave plantations be death-free. Instead, if you start out with slavery, or if you enacted slavery, you sick fuck, you can freely use the violent treatment production method that boosts your total production at the cost of a higher labor or slave mortality. To account for the higher deaths in your plantation buildings, they will also hire way more people. Now let's say you ban slavery but still haven't reached a point in the game where you have workers' rights. Well then, you can just enact exploitative practices that decreases the productivity from violent treatment by 10% but also decreases the mortality rate by the same number. If you aren't a true capitalist of the 19th century and decide that your workers should be safe and enact some labor laws and ban slavery, then you just get standard labor, which just produces the standard amount of products with little to no deaths upon your workers. Boo! These laws should incentivize players to create colonial subjects, that way you can keep the much higher profits and not run into the issue of running out of a population in your own country. Have the mortality be in the colonies. To still discourage players from having slavery, however, the slave trade will decrease your influence by 25%, while legacy slavery will decrease it by 10%. Now, I want to make a slight little comment on colonial slavery, which I think should have some negative modifier, because as I see it right now, they don't really have too much of a modifier, and France and Spain just constantly never bother to ban slavery at all, which is really kind of stupid because by the end of the game they should be banning slavery totally and everywhere. Sure, they should still have exploitative practices, but they shouldn't have slavery at that point in time. But that's a whole different issue. But the abuses of slavery won't be taken without some resistance, as slave communities and discriminated groups of people will now be able to launch slave revolts, forcing you to try to ban slavery as soon as possible, or at least have an army to constantly deal with the slave revolts. On a much brighter note, there are also new production methods that reflect how, as technology developed, the mortality and the need for a larger workforce in plantations decreased. For tobacco plantations, you can even choose to hire individuals to improve the morale of your workforce, making them increase productivity, but make it so wages are just increased by 5% as well. Just give them the chance to listen to the radio while they work, and you'll see the profits, trust me. What are they listening to on the radio? It could be the way politics are playing out with the brand new interactions. The first of the changes coming to politics in Wiki 3 are negotiations. Yes, after 3 long years, you'll finally be able to incentivize your interest groups into helping you pass the laws you want. Their willingness to negotiate is represented through a value called amenability that ranges from 0 to 100. Factors that affect amenability are based on a leader's popularity, the laws you have enacted like secret police, or if they believe that their contributions won't affect the law from passing. They just say they helped, and when it fails, they'll be able to be all the merrier. Now, there are 4 levels to negotiation. Less than 25% means no negotiation. Between 25 to 49 is difficult, where requests and costs are doubled. 50 to 74 is pragmatic, where no modifier is placed on requests or costs. And 75 to 100 is collaborative. All requests and costs will be halved, as these interest groups want the law to be passed as soon as possible. What is being negotiated, you might be wondering? Well, you can give some financial donations to interest groups, but if you get that 1% roll where you are discovered, then it'll just trigger the backroom dealings exposed event. You could also negotiate placing members of an interest group into government, which will increase the interest group's clout at the cost of your effective bureaucracy, since, you just put someone who doesn't have the expertise to be in charge. Finally, you can negotiate expanding certain sectors of military or industry, but make sure you expand, otherwise you could face consequences from the military, such as a drop in approval, legitimacy, an increase in radicals, and a loss in future amenability since, well, you lied to them. But let's say you still need help to pass a law. Well, a new event will pop up granting you the chance to add an amendment to a law. This basically grants certain benefits to an interest group, the acceptance of cultures, construction efficiency, or even decrease the political strength of certain pops. This is definitely a game changer. Moving on, we'll also get regencies, which will replace underage monarchs as the head of government up until they finally reach the age of maturity. No longer will we have little man babies being in charge of a country of over 3 million pops. You'll be able to choose from a selection of politicians, and whoever you select will increase the political strength of that particular interest group's leader, but also cost the government legitimacy and an increase to enactment time. Once reaching maturity, however, they will replace the regent with the true ruler. The dev diary also implies that regents could be overthrown by coups or other such events, so stay tuned for how in the coming weeks. Finally, adding to the amendment system, we're introduced to election rigging through the use of the electoral clientelism. This amendment is inspired by the caciquismo, coronelismo, or mandonismo practices of the Iberian and Ibero-American nations during the 19th century, where landowners would take advantage of the illiterate pops and encourage their communities to vote for a particular side over the other through specific benefits or fear. You know, it's not true Latin politics if there isn't some kind of corruption, let's be honest here. With this amendment, you'll be able to decide the vote of an election at the cost to your legitimacy. If you constantly rig the elections, however, expect your legitimacy to tank massively, as each time will multiply the legitimacy loss. Abstaining from rigging, however, removes some of the penalties. This can be further affected by your free speech laws, with more conservative reducing legitimacy loss, while more liberal laws increase it. Unlike the other laws, electoral clientelism is inheritable by all voting laws, so if you start out with the landed voting and change to wealth or universal suffrage, the amendment will stick around. The only way to get rid of it is by abstaining from rigging 5 times in a row. For the time being, this version of political rigging affects all the nations with the Age of Caudillos journal entry, along with Brazil, Portugal, and Spain. There are plans to add a more generalized version of this amendment in the future, however, but this is the current iteration of it. And that's it for this dev diary itself. The devs responded to some comments, however, saying that you can negotiate once per interest group per law, events may add amendments to laws already enacted, and they're also considering adding similar production methods for mines and other industries if the plantation changes are well received, which really should be. And finally, movement pressure is an amenability factor, but it'll only affect interest groups already supporting the law. So if the slavery movement is advocating for preserving slavery, it won't really affect the amenability factor further for the landowners. Now, if that's all you're here for, just the dev diary, then that's it. This is the end of the video. But if you want my personal thoughts, then here are my personal thoughts. As for my opinions on these changes, I like the new changes. I like the fact that plantations are reflective of how deadly it was to work in these fields, especially sugar plantations where mortality was extremely high. Matter of fact, in the US, any unproductive or troublemaking slave could have been sent as a punishment to the Caribbean. However, it was more of a death sentence rather than a punishment because the likelihood of dying was extremely high. I'm not too sold on electoral clientelism. I like the concept of being more involved in the politics of Vicky 3. However, the fact that the amendment can be removed simply by not rigging 5 times in a row seems like a bit of an oversight. There should be either some bonuses to rig the election, such as a boost to particular interest group clout or higher productivity, because it was very much a give and take system between those in power. So either there are bonuses to rigging, or the other side, the opposition, should also be able to rig. That's what I feel should happen. I also feel that the rigging election should progress the Age of Caudillos event, because the election rigging was one of the ways that ensured Caudillos would remain in power. That leads us into coups. As for coups, I like the idea that they're going to be centered around military leaders. I really hope that they add some events for Mexico, because they had a lot of, and I mean a lot, of coups during the 19th century. The most famous ones being Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's various coup attempts, and technically Porfirio Diaz's coup against Benito Juarez. However, he failed, but still won in the end because Benito Juarez died a few days or months after the failed coup, leading to the eventual rise of the Porfiriato. So yeah, those are my opinions. Let me know what you think. Do you like the changes? Do you not like the changes? What would you like to see? And if you liked the video, maybe leave a like, comment, subscribe, do all those nice things. It would be very much appreciated. And that's it for me. Thank you. Goodbye.